Hi everyone. Welcome to English Story School. Today we uncover the reasons and the hard truths behind these devastating fires. What caused them, what could have been done, and what lies ahead. What happens when a city built on dreams faces a nightmare of destruction? Imagine the vibrant streets of Los Angeles shrouded in smoke, iconic landmarks disappearing behind flames, and thousands forced to flee their homes. This isn't a movie plot. It's the harsh reality of the wildfires that ravaged LA in January 2025. Part 1. The Perfect Storm. How it all began. The fires of January 2025 weren't a sudden catastrophe. They were the result of a perfect storm, an intricate web of factors that had been building for months, if not years. Southern California, with its picturesque landscapes and thriving urban sprawl, has always been a wildfire hotspot. Yet, what unfolded this time was far more devastating, a culmination of extreme weather, human negligence, and a history of climate mismanagement. Imagine Los Angeles, a city bustling with life, suddenly finding itself under siege. The skies, once clear and blue, turned an ominous gray as thick smoke engulfed entire neighborhoods. Streets echoed with sirens and the distant roar of advancing flames. Residents, some prepared but most caught off guard, scrambled to evacuate, grabbing what little they could carry. For many, this wasn't just a fire. It was a nightmare come to life. At the heart of this disaster were the infamous Santa Ana winds. Known for their dry, warm gusts that sweep through Southern California, these winds are a common wildfire accelerant. But in January 2025, they reached unprecedented speeds of over 60 miles per hour. These winds weren't just pushing flames. They were transforming embers into missiles, carrying them miles away to ignite new fires. What could have been contained became an unstoppable chain reaction, with flames leaping across highways and engulfing entire communities. The weather conditions leading up to this disaster were a ticking time bomb. The region had experienced months of drought, leaving vegetation dry and brittle, a perfect fuel for wildfires. Low humidity added to the danger, making it almost impossible for any moisture to curb the spread of the flames. These conditions created an environment so volatile that even the smallest spark had the potential to ignite a massive blaze. But this wasn't just nature's doing. As the fires raged, investigators began to uncover troubling evidence pointing to human involvement. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, launched a full-scale investigation into the origins of the major fires. Early reports suggested that some fires could be traced back to human negligence, discarded cigarettes, unattended campfires, and in some cases, illegal fireworks. These seemingly small acts had catastrophic consequences. One particularly troubling discovery was in the Pacific Palisades area, where investigators found evidence of deliberate arson. While officials were cautious about releasing details, the possibility that someone intentionally set a fire in such dangerous conditions sent shockwaves through the community. It was a harsh reminder that human actions, whether careless or malicious, can amplify natural disasters in unimaginable ways. The fires weren't just a failure of individual responsibility. They were also a reflection of systemic issues. Decades of urban expansion into fire-prone areas had created a dangerous overlap between human settlements and natural landscapes. Housing developments encroached on wildland areas, leaving homes vulnerable to even the smallest ignition. While urban planners had long warned about the risks, the lure of real estate profits often outweighed safety considerations. Adding to this was the inadequate investment in preventive measures. Controlled burns, which are essential for reducing dry vegetation, have been underfunded and inconsistently implemented. Local fire departments, despite their heroics, were stretched thin, lacking the resources to combat such a widespread disaster effectively. As the flames continued to spread, it became clear that this wasn't just a fire. It was a reckoning. It exposed vulnerabilities in the city's infrastructure, gaps in emergency preparedness, and the consequences of ignoring climate realities. Residents who had once felt safe in their homes found themselves questioning how such a disaster could have been allowed to happen. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the fires was their inevitability. Scientists and climate experts have been sounding the alarm for years, warning that rising global temperatures and prolonged droughts were creating ideal conditions for wildfires. Yet, these warnings often fell on deaf ears. The fires of January 2025 were not just a natural disaster. They were a man-made crisis, fueled by years of inaction and complacency. In the aftermath of the fires, the scars left behind were more than physical. Communities were devastated, lives were lost, and trust in the system was shaken. People began to demand answers. Why weren't stricter fire safety regulations in place? Why hadn't the city invested more in prevention? And most importantly, what could be done to ensure this never happened again? As the embers cooled and the smoke began to clear, one thing became painfully evident. The fires of January 2025 weren't just a wake-up call. They were a warning. A warning that unless we confront the root causes of these disasters, history will continue to repeat itself. Whether it's the forces of nature, the failures of policy, or the consequences of human actions, the perfect storm that ignited these fires is one we cannot afford to ignore. This was only the beginning of a tragedy that would reshape the way we think about wildfires, climate change, and the delicate balance between nature and human life. The story of the Los Angeles fires isn't just about what happened. It's about what comes next. The choices we make now will determine whether this becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a long history of devastation. Part 2. The Unstoppable Inferno. When the fires of January 2025 began, they unleashed a force of destruction that few could have imagined. What started as small, isolated blazes quickly escalated into a full-blown inferno, consuming everything in its path. The scale and speed of the devastation were nothing short of apocalyptic. Picture this. Entire neighborhoods engulfed in flames within hours, their once vibrant homes reduced to smoldering ruins. The air thickened with ash, falling from the sky like a dark, foreboding snowfall. Sirens blared incessantly as fire trucks raced against time, their crews fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Families, some still in their pajamas, fled their homes with whatever they could carry: precious mementos, vital documents, or simply the clothes on their backs. The Pacific Palisades fire, one of the earliest and most destructive blazes, started small, as many fires do. But fueled by dry vegetation and the relentless Santa Ana winds, it quickly grew into a monstrous force. Within days, over 10,000 acres had been consumed. The fire didn't just stop at natural barriers. It leapt across highways, spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. Meanwhile, in Altadena, the Eaton fire erupted with similar ferocity. Entire communities were forced to evacuate as the flames marched forward, leveling homes and businesses alike. Nearly 30,000 people found themselves displaced, their lives turned upside down in an instant. The chaos was unimaginable. Emergency shelters overflowed with evacuees, many of whom had no idea if their homes would still be standing when they returned. Social media was flooded with pleas for help, missing persons reports, and updates on the fire's progress. The situation was evolving so rapidly that even the most experienced firefighters were struggling to keep up. Fire crews worked around the clock, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination. They fought not just against the flames, but against the very elements. The winds were unpredictable, shifting directions without warning and spreading embers miles away. These embers ignited new fires in places that had seemed safe just moments before. Resources were stretched to the breaking point. Firefighters from neighboring states were called in to assist, and aerial support was deployed to drop water and fire retardant on the most critical areas. But even with these efforts, the fires continued to rage, their sheer magnitude overwhelming the available manpower and equipment. The fires didn't discriminate. They destroyed homes, schools, hospitals, and even historic landmarks that had stood for generations. The Getty Museum, a cultural treasure, narrowly escaped destruction thanks to state-of-the-art fireproofing measures. But not every site was so fortunate. Iconic locations, beloved parks, and irreplaceable wildlife habitats were lost, their destruction leaving a void that would be felt for years to come. For the residents caught in the path of these infernos, the experience was nothing short of traumatic. Imagine being awakened in the middle of the night by the acrid smell of smoke, only to look out your window and see flames approaching. There's no time to think, only to act. You grab your family, your pets, and whatever you can carry, and you run. The fear is visceral, the uncertainty paralyzing. In the midst of this chaos, acts of heroism shone like beacons of hope. Firefighters braved treacherous conditions to rescue people trapped in their homes. Neighbors banded together to help each other evacuate, sharing vehicles, supplies, and emotional support. Volunteers showed up at shelters with food, clothing, and offers of temporary housing. Yet, despite these moments of humanity, the fires continued to take their toll. Lives were lost, not just to the flames, but to the stress, injuries, and heartache they caused. The emotional scars ran deep, affecting not only those directly impacted, but also the countless people watching helplessly as their city burned. The unpredictable nature of the fires added to the sense of helplessness. Firefighters described the experience as trying to fight a ghost, with flames appearing in new locations almost as soon as they were extinguished in others. The winds acted as an accelerant, spreading the inferno with a speed and intensity that defied even the most advanced fire models. For every blaze that was contained, another seemed to erupt elsewhere, often in areas that were already vulnerable. Schools were evacuated, hospitals were forced to relocate patients, and entire communities were left wondering if they would have anything to return to. This relentless cycle of destruction laid bare the vulnerabilities of a region unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude. It also highlighted the resilience of its people. Amidst the devastation, there were stories of courage, generosity, and an unyielding determination to rebuild. But there were also hard questions to be asked. How had things reached this point? Could the scale of the disaster have been mitigated with better preparation? And most importantly, what needed to change to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again? The fires of January 2025 were more than just a natural disaster. They were a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of nature's fury. They exposed not only the physical vulnerabilities of the region, but also the emotional and psychological toll of living in a world increasingly shaped by unpredictable and extreme events. As the flames raged on, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future. A future where communities could feel safe, where lives weren't constantly at risk, and where the lessons of the past were finally heeded. This was the unstoppable inferno, a disaster that would leave its mark on Los Angeles forever. Part 3. The Role of Climate and Policy. To truly grasp the devastation caused by the fires of January 2025, we must go beyond the visible flames and examine the deeper, more systemic issues that allowed this catastrophe to unfold. While the fires themselves were the immediate threat, the conditions that fueled them have been building for decades. A volatile combination of climate change, flawed policies, and human negligence. Climate change was undeniably a major contributor. Rising global temperatures had drastically altered the environmental balance in Southern California. Years of prolonged drought had left the region's vegetation brittle and dry, turning entire forests into vast, flammable tinderboxes. The moisture that once kept these ecosystems resilient had been sapped away, leaving behind a landscape primed for ignition. But this wasn't just about heat and drought. The warming climate had also intensified the notorious Santa Ana winds, which blew hotter and faster than ever before, spreading embers like missiles across vast distances. These winds, once an occasional seasonal nuisance, had evolved into a recurring nightmare, amplifying the scale and speed of wildfires beyond anything seen in the past. Still, climate change alone didn't light the match. Decades of poor urban planning and inadequate fire safety measures had created a dangerous environment where disaster was inevitable. Southern California's rapid urban sprawl pushed housing developments closer and closer to fire-prone areas, blurring the lines between human settlements and wildlands. This encroachment not only increased the risk of fires reaching populated areas, but also made it harder for fire crews to access and contain blazes before they spiraled out of control. Take, for instance, the practice of building luxury homes on the edges of canyons and hillsides, areas that were not only beautiful, but also highly susceptible to wildfires. Developers prioritized profits over safety, often ignoring warnings from fire safety experts. These homes, while architecturally stunning, became death traps in the face of raging fires, with narrow escape routes and limited water supply compounding the danger. Adding to this was the lack of investment in preventive measures. Controlled burns, an essential tool for reducing excess vegetation and maintaining healthy ecosystems, have been woefully underfunded and inconsistently applied. These burns are critical for removing the dry brush and deadwood that act as kindling for wildfires. Yet, concerns about air quality regulations, budget constraints, and public opposition often delayed or canceled these operations. The result? Overgrown forests and unmanageable fuel loads that made the fires of 2025 almost impossible to contain. The role of politics cannot be ignored either. Over the years, political leaders have been divided in their approach to wildfire prevention and climate resilience. While some push for increased funding for firefighting resources and stricter building codes in fire-prone areas, others downplayed the risks, dismissing climate change as an exaggerated concern. This lack of consensus led to inconsistent policies and a failure to address the root causes of the problem. Consider the firefighting infrastructure itself. Despite the heroism of firefighters, their resources were stretched to the breaking point. Budget cuts and outdated equipment left them ill-equipped to handle fires of this magnitude. Aerial firefighting units, which could have played a critical role in containing the fires early on, were in short supply due to funding limitations. Policy failures extended beyond firefighting. Emergency evacuation plans were often inadequate or poorly communicated, leaving residents confused and unprepared when the fires struck. In some areas, evacuation routes were blocked or overcrowded, leading to chaos and delays. These logistical shortcomings highlighted a lack of foresight and coordination at every level of government. The fires also exposed deep social inequalities. Wealthier neighborhoods, with private fire protection services and better infrastructure, fared significantly better than lower-income communities, where residents often had no choice but to fend for themselves. This disparity raised uncomfortable questions about the equity of disaster response and the allocation of resources. But perhaps the most glaring failure was the refusal to heed the warnings of experts. Scientists and environmentalists had been sounding the alarm for years, predicting that rising temperatures and prolonged droughts would lead to more frequent and severe wildfires. Yet, These warnings were often ignored or dismissed as overly cautious. The fires of January 2025 were not just a natural disaster. They were a man-made crisis, the result of years of inaction and short-sighted decision-making. The aftermath of the fires forced a reckoning. Public outrage grew as the scale of the devastation became clear, with many demanding answers from political leaders and developers. How could such a disaster have been allowed to happen? Why weren't stricter fire safety regulations enforced? And most importantly, what could be done to prevent this from happening again? Experts called for immediate and bold action. This included ramping up controlled burns, enforcing stricter building codes in fire-prone areas, and investing in state-of-the-art firefighting technology. There were also calls to address the root causes of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning to renewable energy sources. But addressing these issues requires more than just policies. It requires a cultural shift. Residents, developers, and policymakers must recognize that the threat of wildfires is not going away. It's no longer a question of if another disaster will strike, but when. Preparing for that reality means embracing a new mindset, one that prioritizes long-term resilience over short-term convenience or profit. The role of climate and policy in the fires of January 2025 serves as a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of our world. The decisions we make or fail to make have consequences that ripple far beyond what we can see. The question now is whether we will learn from this tragedy or continue down a path of neglect and denial. One thing is certain: the fires of 2025 were a wake-up call that cannot be ignored. If we fail to act now, the next disaster may be even more devastating, and history will not judge us kindly for our inaction. The time for change is now, and the lessons of this tragedy must guide us toward a safer and more sustainable future. Part 4. The human cost of the fires. Amidst the towering flames and the endless headlines, it's easy to focus solely on the scale of destruction and forget the faces behind the numbers. The fires of January 2025 weren't just a natural disaster. They were a human tragedy that left scars far deeper than the charred landscapes they created. The statistics are staggering, but the stories of those who lived through this nightmare reveal the true cost of the devastation. Imagine this: a single mother in Altadena, clutching her 2 children as they huddle in a car parked at the edge of an evacuation zone. Behind them, their home, a place filled with laughter, memories, and hope, is reduced to smoldering ash. Her children look to her for comfort, but she has no words to offer. All she can do is hold them close, praying for a miracle that she knows may never come. Or picture an elderly couple in Pacific Palisades, standing in stunned silence as flames consume the home they've spent their entire lives building. The photo albums, the furniture hand-carved by a grandfather, the trinkets collected from decades of travel, all gone in an instant. For them, the loss isn't just material. It's a lifetime of memories erased by a force they couldn't outrun. These stories are not just isolated incidents. They are echoes of thousands of similar experiences across Southern California. Families uprooted, lives shattered, and futures forever altered. The fires didn't discriminate. They tore through affluent neighborhoods with multimillion-dollar homes and humble communities with modest apartments alike. Yet, the disparity in how people could respond to the crisis exposed stark inequalities that became impossible to ignore. Wealthier residents, for example, were able to hire private firefighting services to protect their properties. Equipped with state-of-the-art gear and ample resources, these private crews succeeded where overwhelmed public fire departments could not. But for the majority of residents, those without the means to pay for such services, their only option was to place their trust in firefighters who were already stretched impossibly thin. This disparity sparked outrage. raising questions about the ethics of disaster response in a society where access to safety seemed to depend on wealth. For the firefighters themselves, the emotional and physical toll was almost unimaginable. Battling flames in extreme heat, navigating treacherous terrain, and enduring long shifts with little rest, they pushed their bodies and spirits to the brink. Many described the experience as fighting a losing battle, where every victory felt temporary and the losses felt permanent. Consider the story of Jason, a firefighter who spent 36 hours straight battling the Eden fire. His gear soaked in sweat and soot, his face etched with exhaustion. He spoke about the guilt of having to choose which homes to save. "You want to save them all," he said, "but the reality is you can't, and that stays with you." For many first responders, the aftermath of the fires brought another challenge: post-traumatic stress. Witnessing such widespread devastation, coupled with the weight of knowing that lives were lost despite their best efforts, left deep emotional wounds. These firefighters, hailed as heroes by the public, carried the burden of what they couldn't save, a weight that no amount of accolades could lighten. But amidst the heartbreak and loss, there were also stories of resilience and unity that showcased the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Communities came together in extraordinary ways, offering shelter, food, and comfort to those who had lost everything. Churches and schools transformed into makeshift evacuation centers, where volunteers worked tirelessly to provide a sense of stability in the chaos. In one such center, a group of children sat together, drawing pictures of their homes as they remembered them. Pictures filled with bright colors and smiling stick figures, even as the reality outside was gray and grim. For their parents, these small acts of normalcy were a lifeline, a reminder that hope could still exist even in the darkest moments. Yet, for every act of kindness, there was also a stark reminder of the long road to recovery. Insurance claims were denied or delayed, leaving families to navigate bureaucratic red tape while trying to rebuild their lives. For those who had lost loved ones, the pain was compounded by the knowledge that some of the deaths could have been prevented with better planning, communication, and resources. The fires also exposed the emotional toll on children, many of whom were too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to feel the fear and loss. Schools, once places of safety and learning, became symbols of uncertainty as students returned to classrooms that smelled of smoke and carried the weight of shared trauma. In the weeks that followed, the psychological impact of the fires began to surface more clearly. Therapists reported a surge in patients seeking help for anxiety, depression, and survivor's guilt. Entire communities grappled with the collective trauma of what they had endured, while also trying to find the strength to rebuild. For some, the road to recovery felt insurmountable. But for others, it became a chance to start anew. Stories began to emerge of neighbors pooling resources to rebuild together, of strangers donating supplies and money to help those in need, and of communities vowing to be better prepared for the next time. Because everyone knew there would be a next time. The human cost of the fires wasn't just about what was lost, it was about what was revealed. It laid bare the inequalities, vulnerabilities, and gaps in the system that left so many unprotected. But it also highlighted the resilience, compassion, and strength that emerge when people come together in the face of unimaginable adversity. These fires were more than just a disaster. They were a mirror, reflecting both the best and worst of humanity. The question now is whether we will learn from what we've seen, or whether we'll continue to let history repeat itself at the expense of those who can least afford it. Part 5. Lessons Learned and the Road Ahead. As the smoke settled over the charred remnants of Los Angeles, one question loomed large. What have we learned? The fires of January 2025 weren't just another wildfire. They were a wake-up call, an urgent reminder of how unprepared we are for the challenges of a rapidly changing world. These fires didn't just devastate homes and claim lives. They exposed deep flaws in our systems, our priorities, and our collective mindset. For many, the fires served as a harsh lesson in the consequences of neglect. Climate experts have been warning for years that such disasters were not only possible, but inevitable. Rising global temperatures, prolonged droughts, and stronger winds were creating a perfect storm of conditions for wildfires to thrive. Yet, these warnings were often dismissed, overshadowed by short-term interests and political agendas. One of the clearest lessons from the fires is the urgent need for proactive action. Waiting for disaster to strike before taking meaningful steps is a recipe for repeated tragedy. Fire prevention must become a priority, not an afterthought. This includes investing in early detection systems that can identify fires before they spiral out of control. Advanced satellite technology, drone surveillance, and AI-driven analytics have the potential to revolutionize how we monitor and respond to wildfires. Equally important is addressing the root causes of these disasters. Climate change isn't a distant threat. It's happening now, and its effects are being felt in every corner of the globe. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions, transitioning to renewable energy, and implementing sustainable agricultural practices are no longer optional. They are essential. Without these steps, the conditions that fueled the fires of January 2025 will only worsen. But climate isn't the only factor. Urban development practices must also be re-examined. For decades, Southern California has been a hotspot for sprawling developments that push deeper into fire-prone areas. These homes, often built in picturesque but vulnerable locations, become easy targets for advancing flames. Stricter building codes, better land use planning, and mandatory defensible space around properties can significantly reduce the risk of destruction. Then there's the issue of resource allocation. The fires revealed glaring inequalities in how safety is distributed. While some residents were able to hire private firefighters to protect their properties, others had no choice but to rely on overburdened public services. This disparity isn't just unfair, it's dangerous. Policymakers must ensure that resources are distributed equitably so that everyone, regardless of income, has access to the protections they need. Education is another critical piece of the puzzle. Communities must be equipped with the knowledge and tools to protect themselves. Public awareness campaigns about fire safety, evacuation protocols, and preventive measures can save lives. Schools, workplaces, and local organizations should incorporate fire readiness training into their programs, ensuring that every individual knows what to do in the face of an emergency. However, the lessons of January 2025 aren't just about policies and systems. They're about mindset. These fires forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our relationship with nature. For too long, we've treated the environment as something separate from ourselves, a resource to be exploited rather than a system to be nurtured. This mindset must change. We are not separate from the planet. We are part of it. Protecting it is not just an environmental issue. It's a matter of survival. Gary Vaynerchuk's words resonate deeply in this context. You're one decision away from changing your life. The same principle applies to cities, states, and nations. We are one decision away from building a future where such tragedies are less likely to occur, a future where we protect not just our homes, but our planet. The fires of 2025 also taught us about resilience. In the face of unimaginable loss, communities came together in extraordinary ways. Neighbors helped neighbors, strangers became allies, and entire cities rallied to support those who had lost everything. This spirit of unity is a powerful reminder of what we can achieve when we work together. It's proof that even in the darkest times, hope and humanity can prevail. Looking ahead, The road to recovery will be long and challenging. Rebuilding what was lost will require not just resources, but vision. It's an opportunity to create something better, to design communities that are more resilient, more sustainable, and more prepared for the future. This means incorporating fire-resistant materials into construction, creating green spaces that act as natural fire breaks, and ensuring that every new development adheres to the highest safety standards. But recovery isn't just about physical rebuilding. It's also about healing. The emotional scars left by these fires run deep, affecting not only those who directly experienced the devastation, but also those who watched helplessly as their city burned. Mental health support must be an integral part of the recovery process, providing individuals and families with the tools they need to process their trauma and move forward. As we reflect on the lessons of January 2025, one thing is clear: we cannot afford to go back to business as usual. The fires were not an isolated incident. They were a symptom of larger issues that demand our attention and action. This is a defining moment, a chance to rethink our priorities and reshape our future. The choices we make now will determine what kind of legacy we leave behind. Will we be remembered as a society that ignored the warnings, or as one that rose to the challenge and turned tragedy into transformation? The answer lies in our hands. The road ahead is daunting, but it is also full of possibility. By learning from the past and committing to bold, decisive action, we can build a future where such disasters are less frequent and less devastating. A future where we don't just react to crises, but prevent them. A future where we live in harmony with a planet that sustains us. The fires of Los Angeles in January 2025 were a devastating reminder of what's at stake. But they were also a call to action, a chance to do better, to be better. The question now is, will we answer that call? The fires of Los Angeles in January 2025 were a stark reminder of the power of nature and the consequences of neglect. They took lives, destroyed homes, and left scars that will take years to heal. But they also left us with lessons about resilience, responsibility, and the urgent need for change. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time,